Coach Zoe,
Coach TJ,
what's going on?
not much.
We're back.
We're back. Schedule has remained crazy, which I'm sure a lot of athletes identify with. The summer is such a big season for so many of us, coupled with the fact that as I was on my way out the door to go race the Silver Rush 50, my computer finally died.
Oof,
So
tough timing with the...
definitely made producing a podcast / being a coach difficult.
You know, I spilled coffee on my computer about a year ago, and if it wasn't for crew chief Jordan Hero, I would not have been able to coach for about 3 days.
Yeah, shout out to Jordan Hero for keeping us online and in line.
How are you feeling after your race?
Pretty okay. My legs feel good. It was not a great, and we'll get into this later, it was not a super great race, so I didn't get to run as hard as I would have liked, so my legs aren't very sore. So that's a good bonus, but, you know, I think something that's so important for athletes to understand is, like, regardless of how the day went, you have to respect rest. So, you know, even though I would love to get right back into training, right back into charging hard, I know that given my goals and what I want to do, I have to just sit with how I'm feeling. You know, even though I feel pretty good, even though I didn't race to my potential, running 50 miles, running any amount of miles is still really tough on the body. So I'm still really focusing on recovery and taking care of myself. Just out of camera, I have a coffee protein shake that has 40 grams of protein in it.
Nice.
Yeah, I've been blending cottage cheese into my shakes to help bulk it up with protein.
Oh my God.
You're looking at 40 grams
I think listeners
of protein,
out there are
75
like,
milligrams of caffeine. No, I saw it on Instagram, so it's a thing.
So
it's real.
it's definitely real.
Yeah.
It's probably really good for you because you saw it on Instagram.
Well, I mean, cottage cheese is good for you.
Oh, it's so gross. I can't believe you eat that.
No, drink it.
No
Have
way.
a sip.
Nope.
Have a sip.
Nope.
Have a sip.
Nope.
Do it.
Nope.
Do it.
I don't eat cheese. Nope.
Well, can you drink cheese?
Hell no.
Haven't you always wanted to drink caffeinated cheese?
No.
This is human performance at its best.
Get that away from me. No, that is not for me. I'm glad it works
When
for
I
you.
recover the best ever from drinking caffeinated cheese, you can call me.
Well,
Caffeine cheese would be an incredible product. If there was a caffeinated cheese product, I would buy the shit out of that.
listeners, I am interested in your take on caffeinated cheese.
Caffeine cheese.
Send me an email.
Yeah, I'm going to call it inner cheese.
What are we getting into today?
Just for an outline of where we're going, we're going to do some hot or nots. Then we're going to do a Silver Rush 50 debrief. And then I wanted to talk a lot about altitude training. And I think this is a great discussion for any and all athletes, whether or not you're going to be racing or competing or training at altitude, because the physiology is really, really interesting and important. And there's takeaways for everyone there.
Love that. Absolutely.
And the science is just super cool. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about altitude training. And yeah, just can't wait to get into it. It's super relevant to me as I'm training for the Leadville 100. And I know a lot of other athletes really struggle with, like, how much should I be training at altitude? What should I be doing? Mm-hmm. So we're going to break it all down.
Let's do it.
All right. Hot or not, TJ? Salt pills.
Hot.
Yeah. Tell me why.
Because you need electrolytes out there.
You
And
do.
It's a easy way to get your electrolytes with a quantifiable amount of sodium in there for each capsule. It's very easy to keep track. So, you know, I think we're all about sodium per hour, ounces per hour, grams of carbs and calories per hour. Everything's by hour.
Yeah.
It's just so much easier to get it done.
Yes.
If you take
something
salt.
that I am increasingly seeing, particularly in my athletes who are transitioning from road to trail running, is people are trying to be like, oh, well, I have this many calories every XYZ miles. That is not typically how most people, like most nutritionists, encourage fueling. It might be slightly different if you're competing at a marathon, but anytime you're doing a long run, anytime you're doing a race that's not exactly like isn't a road marathon, you want to be counting your electrolytes, your fluid intake, your calories, and your carbohydrates on a per hour basis, particularly on trail running, because you can have a mile that takes anywhere from 6 minutes to 24 minutes, right? So if you're only fueling let's say you're fueling every 3 miles, I mean, that could be 20 minutes or that could be an hour and a half, right? So we really want to make sure that people are thinking about fueling in terms of time as opposed to every, 2 miles or whatever. End of soapbox there. I'm also very hot on salt pills, but with the caveats that it really depends on your particular electrolyte or your particular sodium loss rate. And you definitely want to practice with salt pills because it can cause GI distress for athletes. I definitely recommend practicing with just taking one at a time and then, finessing from there. It can really cause stomach upset if you immediately take in 700 milligrams of sodium via salt pills. So as always, practice these things and make sure that you are really trying to dial in your specific sodium rate because it's just so wildly variable person to person.
Absolutely. You've got to know what your sodium concentration is, the sodium concentration of your sweat. If you know that, then it's much easier to gauge whether or not those salt pills are going to work for you based on the other electrolytes you're taking in and your fluid loss and fluid intake and all of that. It's complicated. We've talked about this on
I feel like we never stop talking about it, but I do keep having athletes emailing me that they're having issues. So we'll keep talking about it until the whole world is healed through salt pills. All right, TJ, what do you think about giving blood while training?
So cold.
Yeah.
Keep your blood volume. Keep it all.
Yeah, this is tough because there is definitely a need out there for blood, right? Like people aren't giving blood as much and there is like a nationwide shortage on it. However, I would really caution athletes from giving blood. And if you do feel compelled to do so, don't do it in the build up to a big race. Don't do it in the middle of a big training block. Make sure that you are accounting for the sort of metabolic tax this is going to put on your body, the iron loss tax this is going to put on your body. Maybe for athletes who are not if it's the middle of winter, you're not training very specifically for something, great, knock yourself out, but just understand that it is pretty detrimental to training. And I would be particularly reluctant to encourage menstruating athletes to do this because there can already be so many sort of downsides to this. Again, this is tough to say because the world does need blood, but there's just a lot of health risks when it comes to athletes who are training very, very intentionally.
Keep your blood.
Keep your blood. Send me your blood if you have good blood. Actually, let me see what your iron levels are before I accept your blood.
Whoa. Hold on. We're looking for any and all legal ways of increasing blood volume here.
Right. So literally just draining yourself is really not what we want to do.
Don't take blood from others.
Yeah, no blood robbing. All right, TJ, hot or not, taking a multivitamin.
I don't know. Is this hot? Is it not? I think it's not hot.
Yeah, that's my perspective. So the best thing to do, rather than taking a multivitamin, which is kind of just throwing shit at the wall, the best thing to do is to work with an expert like Kylie Van Horn of Fly Nutrition or with your primary healthcare provider to target any specific micronutrient deficiencies you have. Most people who take a multivitamin end up peeing most of it out. So it's just sort of a way of making your urine very expensive and you're just sort of shooting in the dark. It may or may not address any micronutrient deficiencies you have. And the research on multivitamins is super, super mixed and actually inconclusive. It's really hard to decouple the fact that people who take multivitamins tend to be healthier. So there's really not been a study that definitively shows taking a multivitamin makes you healthier. So what I would say is save that money, go see a nutritionist to identify and remediate any specific micronutrient deficiencies that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think just eat a balanced diet.
Yes, and that's another thing is I think that for most people, focusing on having high quality daily nutrition is always going to be a better approach than, any sort of hack, any sort of green powder. Again, if you have a specific micronutrient deficiency, it is always okay to supplement according to the guidelines of an expert like Kylie Van Horn at Fly Nutrition or like your primary healthcare provider. There's nothing wrong with supplementing if you have an identified deficiency.
Yeah.
But again, just throwing shit at the wall is not the best strategy.
Right. Tons of athletes supplement, but multivitamin is not a cure-all.
It is not. As is, no supplement is a cure-all, unfortunately. I say as I drink my caffeinated cheese shake.
It looks so gross.
It looks amazing. It looks like a Frappuccino with some chunks. No. And not even that many chunks.
Oh, gosh. Okay, hot or not, racing at altitude.
I don't know.
I know you think it's cold after your Silver Rush experience.
It's so hard.
Altitude's got your number right now.
I know. But I feel like I'm good at altitude, but it just causes some stuff. So we'll get into that. But what do you think about racing at altitude?
I think if you live at altitude, racing low is the hottest thing you can possibly do.
We live in Colorado, so TJ can go crush California races.
It's just so fun to feel like you can run
It's fun to feel
the
good.
hills
Yeah.
and be running at mile 99 of
Yep.
Western states. I mean, it's awesome.
It is awesome.
And, you know, when you're at altitude, you got to hike a lot.
Yep.
And, you know, I just think about what brings me more joy. Running more hills and
Feeling good.
brings
Yeah.
you more joy.
But I think that gets to an overall point that I really want athletes to internalize is that altitude is fucking hard for fucking everyone.
Yeah, it's
yes,
tough.
genetically there's some people who are more predisposed to have struggles at altitude or more inclined to have altitude sickness. People born at altitude and gestated, importantly, at altitude are going to succeed a little bit more. But I think the big sort of like headline here is be kind to yourself. Don't be a dick. If you're, you know, if it feels hard to run at altitude, that's normal.
Yeah, that's because running at altitude
That's because it's just really hard.
is hard.
Yeah. So this weekend I raced the Silver Rush 50, which is the 50-mile course in Leadville, and it was a struggle bus.
There was you got it done.
But it also was only, yes, I did. So I went into this race with, you know, primarily my like big goal was to race it better than I did the last time I did it in 2019 and to learn and get ready for the Leadville 100. So I actually succeeded in both of those goals, even though it felt completely shitty the whole time. So I think that's why it's always so good to debrief these things with your coach, with your trusted training partner, because like even though emotionally I didn't feel that awesome about this race, on paper it was still a very useful and productive day.
How so? What? I mean, it was a little PR. It's a little baby PR.
I PR'd by 50 seconds, you
Yeah.
guys.
But
Make sure you send flowers to my place of residence.
it was a much different day than
Yeah.
the race you'd had a couple years ago there. So
Yes.
how are you looking at this as a celebration? How are you looking at this as progress and avoiding what I feel are some pretty obvious like traps or stories you could get in that
Right.
maybe wouldn't support you moving forward towards your big goal, which is Leadville?
Correct. Right. Well, I think that, you know, I think the big thing I keep coming back to is that as you get better, that doesn't mean that you will never have bad days. Unfortunately, you can train as hard as you want and you're still going to have shit days running because running is hard and there's nothing you can do to save yourself from having bad days. That's just part of the deal, unfortunately. However, I think a big lesson from this weekend is that the bad days do get better. You know, they get faster at least. Like there's a little less crappiness on the bad day. Because essentially like what happened is this is a really high altitude course. It was also pretty hot. When I raced this race in 2019, it actually snowed during the race. So the climate was a bit different. I tend to do well in the heat, so that wasn't a major concern. But I just keep running into some really gnarly hydration issues that I'm actually going to be continuing to sort of assess on my own, both with an actual healthcare provider and doing additional sweat testing because I'm just experiencing something that is like way off the charts uncommon for even racing at altitude. But the big thing is that I went into this race with a pretty bold goal of running it in 8 hours. I missed that by 46 minutes, unfortunately. But at halfway, I was on track to hit that split. So I'm definitely celebrating that because I do believe I'm still capable of that. And I'm proud of myself for trying as best as possible to execute on that.
That's awesome.
I also assumed I had an A outcome goal, which was running it in 8 hours. My B outcome goal, which was beating my previous time of 8:48, and then my C goal, which was finishing the race. Because even though that is always going to be a really important goal for me, finishing the race, unless my long-term health is at risk, because particularly knowing that my primary goal for this race was to use it to get ready for the Leadville 100, even if it's a shitty day, even if I'm not feeling good, even if I'm not having fun, no matter what, just staying in it will continue to deliver me lessons that I'll need to implement at the 100. And it definitely was that. Just to be vulnerable, I came into the mile 34 aid station crying because I just felt so shitty and tired. We got a terrible night of sleep the night before the race. I think I got like four hours, and I also was just having crazy hydration issues. I was unable to retain any fluid despite hitting exactly the electrolyte goals that were identified through my level and sweat test. So that was really, really frustrating because I felt like I was doing everything right and my body was still not cooperating the way I wanted it to. But I went in to see you at the mile 34 crew point, and we just sort of debriefed for a second, and then I tried to get out of there, and I was actually able to rally. I passed like 4 people in that next section, was able to run all of the uphill, and I was really, really proud of that. And I think that something that I was thinking of was just a few days before this race, I had done an interview with Courtney DeWalter for the Ultra Sign Up podcast, and she was like, the number one thing that I need people to understand about ultra running is that the answer to almost every issue is give it time.
Right.
It will get better. You just have to stay curious about it. You have to keep pushing to see if it will get better. And so even though I felt really, really shitty at mile 34, which is like kind of late into that race, I was like, you know what? Maybe it will get better. And even if it doesn't, I'm still capable of finishing this race, which is sometimes an unfortunate conclusion to come to because it means that you might just have a long, hard day rather than a DNF, which is easy to do. And gutting it out, especially way past your goal time, is pretty tough. But I think the big lessons here is the importance of when you're racing, having those A, B, and C goals, outcome goals. We always want to talk about like what you want out of an event, and then you want to back those up with process goals, which is something that we talk about all the time. And then raising the floor, again, I think is a really, really big one. It's always tempting, especially for athletes like me that have been training for a long time, to want every single race to be a breakthrough, every single race to be a PR. It was tough because I had just PR'd my 50K in June, and I believed I could PR on this course as well. But that wasn't the day I was dealt, and I was still proud that I was able to finish 50 seconds faster than the last time I did it because the floor had gotten so much higher. So I think it's always never go looking for proof that you're not improving, and always stay curious about what other stories you can tell yourself.
Yeah, I think that that's the biggest lesson here because, you know, it's been a few years since you've run this race. You had high expectations and standards for yourself going in. I think there is a certain way of being that you also wanted to project at this event. And I think you got off track on a lot of those things because of the way that just the day was going. And, you know, at mile 38, seeing you kind of like respond to the adversity and go out of that aid station, having come in not doing very well, not very positive at all, really, honestly, and to just like kind of like externalize that and then, you know, reorient yourself in the way that you want it to be. And the way that you want to be is not conditional on whether or not you're getting the specific results you want.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that that is super important for athletes to realize. Who you want to be operates outside of the parameters that you set for yourself based on your goals. Who, you know, and this whole thing is really the whole idea of having standards around your race, a way of being around your race, is to have something to lean on when it gets hard. Because when the miles are just flowing and it's snowing out there and you're not hot and it's all good, like, who gives a shit who you are? Like, it's just happening. It's happening for you. You feel really good. Probably there's some elements of flow going on there. And so you're not really conscious of any of these other things that are kind of like foundational to performance. And so, you know, if you're pushing on your growth edge, which you were doing throughout the race, even though it wasn't maybe the output that you wanted for that edge, you were still on that edge. And that demands a specific understanding of who do I want to be. You said I need to be calm. I need to be outcome oriented. in terms of doing my absolute best. I need to run more of the uphills. A big goal that you had going into the race was running that freaking climb out of that last aid station. I mean, that's an annoying climb.
Yeah. And I fucking did it.
Yeah. And so, like, you know, that is who you had to show up as. And although the outcome wasn't, you know, precisely what you wanted, and you set a big goal for yourself, which of course you're capable of doing, I think the important thing in there that's going to really help take you to the next level at Leadville is that you got to practice in a hard moment being the person that you want to be when things are hard. Yeah, you felt shitty. Yeah, you had some externalizing, some negative feelings and things like that. But I do think that that's kind of important in a longer race. Like, the more you internalize that, like, this, the more that it festers.
And I think it's okay, like, you know, I externalized how I was feeling to you, but then I also went back to how do I want to show up, and I did that. And a big mantra that I had going into this race was make the choice, particularly when it comes to responding to adversity, particularly when it comes to running uphill. And a framework that I used, which was really helpful, was like, you have to choose to run uphill. It will never feel easy. It will never be the easier option. And if it was, you wouldn't actually be making a choice. You would just be defaulting. Mm-hmm. And I never wanted to be defaulting in this race, especially like when it gets hard mentally. The default would just be to quit or to let my foot off the gas and say, well, it's not my day. I can just walk it in, or I can just quit here. I wanted to make the choice to say, even though this day isn't easy and it's not flowing and things aren't clicking, I'm still going to choose to compete, which is the harder thing to do.
Absolutely. But it's the thing that is in most integrity with you at a deep level. So I think that that's really why that's important. And I almost feel like for any athlete at any level who has a big goal, like, for example, you're running Leadville 100. It's a really very difficult 100 at elevation. It's almost better to have a day that doesn't like quite go to plan leading up to a race like that. So you have a prime example of, like, here's me showing up when I didn't feel my best, acting in alignment with who I want to be, staying on top of my standards, doing everything I can to stay on the growth edge, whatever that looks like. And, you know, continuing, like, to power forward, because you're going to need that at some point of Leadville, no doubt. And so having this strong example of that's going to help build your self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to do that. Had this day just been, you know, a flowy, just like, you know, unicorn and rainbow
which is what
day,
it was last time, which makes it really easy to compare. Because the first time I did this race, and I got 6th both times, I finished within a minute of both times. And it was like I had just an amazing day where the first time I ran Silver Rush, it felt easy and it clicked, and I was having fun and dancing and smiling at all the aid stations. And this weekend, it was just the absolute opposite. But I still finished, and I'm still counting it as a win because I am learning, I am growing, and running 50 miles will always be something worth celebrating. Competing through the finish line will always be something worth celebrating. And it's always useful to practice how to move on from tough races. So for me, it's about having conversations with the continue conversations with my coach. So I'm going to start potentially looking into, again, some physiological stuff I'm investigating with my doctor. And I sort of needed the kick in the pants to escalate it to the level of, well, maybe this is more of a medical issue than like an electrolyte issue. I'm going to continue honing my hydration strategy and my fluid intake. And I'm going to continue training the way I've been training, because I was just charging up the uphills in a way that I'm really, really proud of. And my best advice for anyone who's interested in training for the Silver Rush 50, my number one training tip for Silver Rush is running economy.
Yeah.
Like, that shit is super important when you're trying to run uphill at altitude. This race is not that steep. It is not a mountain race, no matter how many pictures of mountains you see on the website. Don't get fooled. I would not recommend using poles on this race. I saw a lot of people with poles. Don't use poles. Just get better at running uphill. Yeah. That's a hot take.
Just get better at running. And then
just get better at running. And then you'll get better at running uphill.
Right.
Get fitter. That's just the best advice for all races, but particularly I think something like this. And, you know, moving on, I'm just going to take this week to really recover, really take care of my body, focus on my health, talk with my care team, and continue to I'm going to not tell myself a story about what this means for Leadville. I'm going to learn and I'm going to stay curious, but I am not going to graft my experience from this weekend onto the future.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
So let's talk about altitude training, because this is relevant to you as an athlete going into Leadville in 6 weeks. And we've got a ton of folks on the team who are doing races that are at elevation, Run Rabbit Run, TMR, Tushers, I don't know,
Wasatch 100.
Wasatch 100 come to mind as a few things. And I think there's just a lot of misconception about altitude. I think the biggest thing that I see is that like athletes think by running at elevation, they're going to somehow get acclimated to the altitude. And it's just completely untrue.
Yeah, I think this is, again, I think a big theme of Microcosm in general is focus on the big picture, not the details. And I think particularly with beginner or intermediate athletes, people get really drawn into these like R/ultramarathon holes of like, well, this guy in Wisconsin said he used an altitude tent and I need to do that.
Right.
Actually, the reason I wanted to talk about blood donation is because I was Reddit sleuthing myself, and one guy on Reddit literally was recommending giving blood as a way of training for altitude, which is so fucking stupid that I needed to lay down for a second.
I hope you didn't comment on it.
It took me everything I had not to just fucking altitude train his asshole.
I know you want to start trolling on those Reddit forums.
But instead, I'm channeling my reaction into positive communication.
Yes.
Like my therapist said.
Good job.
But I think that we see a lot of people get distracted by altitude, so we really wanted to break down what's useful, what should you just totally ignore. Ignore anything on Reddit would sort of be my 10 cents. You're working with a coach, you're listening to our podcast, you're already in a good place. But one really big misconception is people think the air is actually thinner at altitude. It's not. The composition of gases that make up the air around you is the same at all altitudes. But as you go higher, there is a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, and your lungs rely on a certain pressure gradient. So when there's less oxygen, in a lung full of air due to the pressure change. The air is not actually thinner.
What does that cause physiologically?
Yeah, so your body senses the reduced oxygen pressure, and that causes an increase in breath rate. That's why you breathe harder at altitude. Because of that, your heart is going to beat more rapidly, and your cardiac stroke output decreases, and your digestion's impaired. And I think that's important to recognize, because it's not just, your like the air pressure, or it's not just like your lungs that are feeling it. Pretty much every body system is impacted by altitude, and there's actually a lot of really interesting science showing that folks that live at altitude might even be more susceptible to some like mental illness and cognitive issues from chronic altitude exposure. But what does this all mean? When you go to altitude, your body needs to go through a series of adaptations very quickly to counter your decreased ability to transport oxygen efficiently. So hypoxia is the state in which oxygen isn't sufficiently available to maintain homeostasis. But your body can adapt. Again, it's not just about your lungs, and a lot of these adaptations that happen throughout our bodies, some take place in the first 24 hours at altitude, and some take 2 to 3 weeks. And I think that that's a really important time frame. So let's think about...
let's think about what that means for athletes. If most of the adaptations take place in about 2 weeks, if you're going up to altitude 24 to 48 hours before a race, what's really happening there?
Almost nothing. You're minimizing the harms is what's happening in 24 hours.
Because going up to altitude and sleeping up there before a race causes a lot of stress on the body.
Yep.
Because the body gets stressed and then it starts to produce those adaptations. But the adaptations don't happen that quickly.
Correct.
So in order to minimize that, the recommendation is to arrive as close to the start of that race as you can.
Correct. So the recommendation guided by the research is you should either get there 18 to 24 hours before the start or 7 to 10 days. You want to avoid that gray zone of like, well, I'll go out 3 to 4 days, or like I'll go out 1 week before. 1 week, 3 to 4 days, that's just long enough to have really shitty recovery, and it's not long enough to actually get like the positive impacts from staying at altitude.
I feel like especially at these races like High Lonesome and Wasatch and freaking Leadville.
Yeah.
I mean, so much, almost all of Leadville is above 10,000 and, or at least above 9.
Yeah.
And so, like, gosh, if you're an athlete who lives at sea level, or even if you're an athlete that only lives at 5,000 or 6,000 feet like us,
Yeah.
you're actually, for every 3,000 feet you go up, you're going to feel the impacts. It's going to be stressful to your body.
Yep.
And so, something that we talked about, I have no idea what you're going to do for Leadville, is just like, how early can we arrive before that race logistically?
Yeah.
Or should we book an Airbnb like 10 days from the race?
Yeah.
Because like those are really important questions for an athlete, honestly, of any level.
Correct.
Who's considering doing a race at altitude, but certainly for somebody who's going to be competing for a podium position up there, we don't want sleep to be impacted before the race. So we do need to make those considerations. And also that's in alignment with the science. Stress is stress. Fatigue from travel impacts your ability to handle the heat. It impacts your hydration status. Add altitude to that, man, we've got like a cocktail of stresses that aren't really very good for race performance.
Right. And I know that's frustrating because for a lot of our athletes, they have jobs, they have families. They can't just get an Airbnb in Leadville for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But again, when you realize that that isn't the best option for you, you can free yourself to then just show up the day before the race. And again, this is what all of the research is indicating. The worst time frame is 2 to 4 days before your event, because you'll have bad sleep, fatigue from travel, and dehydration.
Oh my gosh, my whole Leadville experience wrapped up into one sentence.
Into a haiku. Into a poet slam. So I think another thing I want to talk about is, like, oftentimes you will hear, particularly from athletes that live at sea level and in humid environments, they will ask us, can you use heat to train for altitude? And a quote that really resonates with me is from our coach, David Roche, is that training for altitude at sea level is kind of like practicing kissing on an apple. Sure, you can do it, but it's just not the same. So heat stress acclimation does expand your blood volume by 15+%, and it does spur natural EPO production. So those are positive things that are akin to altitude training. Heat stress can also improve cardiac performance at altitude, or at least make the acclimation process proceed a little more rapidly, which is why some people call heat the poor man's altitude. However, these things are not the same, right? So I don't want people to conflate, well, like, oh, I live in Texas, so I should be just fine for Leadville. Well, you'll get 1 to 3 adaptations that are positive for altitude, but it's just not the same. So I think that, again, like, if you're trying to trick yourself into thinking that you're doing exactly the same amount of preparation at sea level because you're running in the heat, that's just not true. That doesn't mean you need to stress about it, right? Because again, the best use of your time is always, always, always going to be just getting fitter. I do just want to clear up this really common misconception that heat and altitude are exchangeable.
I think you hit it right there. What should an athlete be focusing on? An athlete should be focusing on their training, maximizing how much volume can I do in a week safely within the constraints of my life and the other stresses and priorities that I have. The fitter you are, the better you're going to do at altitude.
Yeah, get fitter. If you can do that, you don't even have to listen to the rest of the podcast. You can go make yourself a cheese shake and tune out. So I think, speaking of cheese shakes, another really important thing about altitude is will change your hydration and fueling needs, which is a good reason to try to train a bit at altitude. Mm-hmm. So at higher elevations, your body is working harder to get oxygen, which increases your breath rate. And since you lose water through respiration, that results in greater fluid loss. The air is drier. There are some studies that show that even people who have chronic altitude exposure, people who live at altitude, typically need about 1 liter to even 1.5 liters more water per day, like 4 to 6 cups, more than people who live at lower altitudes. But again, hydration is never a one-size-fits-all prescription. Your fluid intake should vary based on the weather, the amount you exercise, and overall health. But if you're training in Texas and you're expecting to do well at the Leadville 100, you're going to have a rude awakening because you will need to trial your hydration and nutrition strategies at altitude. Even, for our folks who like live in Boulder, live in Flagstaff, and then they're racing up higher,
same thing.
Make sure on the weekends you are getting up high and you are practicing taking in your hydration and your nutrition that you plan on using for your race at altitude, because as we said, the altitude can affect your digestion. It will actually affect your hunger cues. So people who live at altitude, particularly extreme altitudes like above 9,000 feet, are more susceptible to RED-S or relative energy deficiency in sport. So just know that and also you can fart more at altitude. It fucks the whole system up. TJ's laughing because he has no altitudes.
Altitudes. Ooh,
Yep.
I like that.
Yeah,
That's
altitudes. It's a thing. And just make sure that you are trialing this stuff.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
What do you recommend in terms of trialing? Do you recommend like a altitude training camp? Do you recommend just, a run a week close to the elevations you'll see on your race? Like, what does this look like for athletes?
I do recommend for athletes who are planning on racing at altitude that you do train a little bit at altitude. I think we want to be clear on what the goal of training at altitude is. It's not actually to provoke acclimatization. You're not going to be there long enough to meaningfully get any benefits. It's more about calibrating expectations and trialing your nutrition and hydration.
Yeah, understanding how your body responds to exercising up there.
Because even if you do all your long runs at altitude, that's not really meaningfully going to change your physiology. It will change your psychology and your ability to moderate your effort at altitude, which is important too.
Yep.
So I do recommend that athletes do an altitude training camp if they're racing at altitude. You usually want to schedule this 4 to 6 weeks away from competition. And the primary goal, again, I can't enforce or iterate this enough, the primary goal is to gain an understanding of how your body responds to exercise at higher altitudes. These short altitude training camps are not long enough to lead to an increase in oxygen carry capacity. Your camp would need to be 21 days long to really have that impact, but they're still important. Especially for sea-level athletes, it's all about learning to control that throttle. And you need to, sorry, I've got like burps from my cheese coffee.
Too much cheese.
Too much cheese beverage.
Oh, gross.
No, it's amazing. Burping is healthy and good.
Good. At altitude, you get the altitude burps.
But again, at sea-level athletes really need to understand power output and perceived exertion changes at altitude.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are actually probably those two things plus nutrition, trialing your nutrition at elevation are the three most important things you're going to get out of the training camp. And, it's going to be stressful. It's going to produce some adaptations, blood volume increase and things like that while you're training at camp. But if you're actually training up high because you're going to race up high, those are the three things to mainly focus on.
Yeah. And actually, the research, like if you were a bajillionaire who could build a house wherever you wanted in the world, the most optimal thing to do is to recover high, train low. Because if you're always training high, you're really going to be limiting your speed and economy development. So you want to be training low to really reinforce those top end biomechanical outputs, and then recovering high to get those big hematocrit adaptations. So that's why the research says train low, recover high. But that's just not I literally don't know anyone who can do that.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe if you live in Leadville and then every day you drove down to Buena Vista would be the only thing I could think of.
And it's still not quite enough of a difference. You'd need that 3,000 feet, that window. So really, you need to live in Leadville, train in Carbondale.
Yeah. Or, this is the reason some people invest in altitude tents, which I don't really recommend for the majority of athletes, because we're really focusing on having high quality training sessions. And if you're trying to sleep, I've had an athlete jack theirs up to 13,000 feet. You don't need to do that. You're just really going to be undermining your recovery. There can be bad health impacts for that. I know it would not be so great for our partnership if one of us was trying to sleep in a tent.
Nope.
TJ's a snuggler, so that's not his thing.
I'd rather get my 8 hours and be less acclimated.
Correct.
And sleep in a tent.
When we do work with athletes who are training for mountaineering things, that's sort of a different conversation.
Yeah.
But right now we're primarily talking about altitude training in the context of ultra running, because very few of our athletes are truly training for mountaineering.
Trail running in general. There's plenty of high races that aren't ultra distance.
And even marathon. We have road runners who, use this stuff, but for our couple, athletes who do Himalayan expeditions, you can tune out now and go get yourself a cheese drink. So the most practical option for improving a sea-level athlete's performance at altitude is arriving at altitude with the best possible fitness. Get fitter. Train well. Don't do stupid shit. for marginal gains.
Yeah.
As always, your goal should be to focus on fitness. Altitude training protocols like live high, train low, or live high, train everywhere work. Altitude tents can be beneficial, but these things are often just like not that practical for amateur and time crunched athletes because they're expensive, they're time consuming, and they're disruptive to the athlete's life.
I think so too, especially from a holistic perspective. How is that athlete's sleep? How is their eating? If you're sleeping in a tent, it's gonna cause stress. That's gonna impact your hunger cues. You're likely gonna be less hungry. You're gonna eat.
You're gonna be under recovering, and that's gonna undermine your training.
Right, and so there kind of in lies like the biggest challenge with all of this is what gains are worth going for. What's the kind of the low hanging fruit that we can grab? Okay, maybe some runs in warm temps, maybe a few sauna sessions, but not so much that like it impacts your ability to actually train, because the primary focus has to be on the training. And then if you introduce any of these other variables, you have to adjust your training because it's stress, right? So like if we're thinking about this from a maximized fitness perspective, you're doing all you can to train. You're doing the most you can do healthfully in the context of your life. We have to take volume away or intensity away to add a sauna session, to add, if we're going to start doing runs in the heat, we have to make adjustments because there's other stress there that can then inhibit your ability to adapt to the most important thing, which is the training itself. So, looking at this stuff again with that holistic lens, what really can I be maximizing? What are the most important gains? What's the low-hanging fruit? Is it possible to work some of this in? Am I already maximizing my training? There's questions to be answered. A lot of athletes probably get frustrated by hearing this, but it's important to be honest and authentic. Likely trying to find time for a sauna or running more in the heat is just not, for most athletes, it's just not going to be worth it.
Yeah, if for several years you've been absolutely maximizing your fitness, then let's chat. Yeah. But if you're just trying to get to the finish line of this race, or you've only been working with us, or even if you're not working with a coach, I would really not recommend any of this stuff. Like the poor dudes, I'm gendering them all as men, but I feel like spiritually anyone who is recommending donating blood as an altitude training protocol on Reddit is spiritually male. The fitter you are, the more capacity you have to handle higher altitudes. So your focus should be on building fitness. The total volume of work and the quality of workouts should always be the first priority, rather than over-reliance on interventions like altitude camps, altitude tents, weird supplements, hot boxing, moving to Texas to train, whatever it is. So let's talk about some pre-race strategies. One thing that we definitely recommend for athletes, especially if you're training at altitude, but also always, is to get an iron panel done through your PCP 3 months ahead of time. Low iron status stored as ferritin will impact your body's ability to create hematological adaptations at altitude. So identify if you have low iron and low ferritin, and then work with your PCP or a provider like Kylie Van Horn at Fly Nutrition to dial in your diet and potential micronutrient supplementation to make sure that your altitude training will actually produce positive adaptations.
Absolutely. I think that's actually something that is really overlooked. There's no point in doing altitude training camp of any kind if you have low iron.
Yeah, it's going to be a bad time.
You're not going to get the adaptations you want. You're likely going to end up more stressed than is helpful, and it's probably going to negatively impact your training.
Yeah. So again, make sure that your health is good, make sure that your training is good, and then think about what time frame you can arrive early to your race. So if you live in a vacuum, you're a bajillionaire, you don't have to take care of your family, you can just move to Leadville or do whatever you want. The guidelines that are recommended in the research are you want to arrive 3 to 5 days early for races that are between 1,600 feet and 6,500 feet. You want to arrive 1 to 2 weeks early for races that are between 6,500 feet and 9,800 feet. And then you want to arrive 3 weeks early for races that are above 9,800 feet. I work from home.
Is this as if you live at sea level?
Yeah, correct.
So for you, I
would still want to arrive at if I actually wanted to fully be acclimated, it would be 21 days, you know? And that's tough. But
I don't think that's necessarily true because we are already at 6,200 feet.
right, but it's still a 30% decrease in oxygen pressure.
But you're going to adapt faster to 9,400 feet than somebody who's living at sea level.
Fair, but still, I don't want to arrive 3 days before the race and expect that that's going to get me all the way there.
I just wonder if it's more like 10 days.
Right, yeah, this is for athletes living at sea level. So again, like I think that these things can and should impact your race selection. And that's not to say that if you live at sea level, you should never race at altitude. If you want to race at altitude, that's awesome. But just don't try to be in that weird gray zone of doing a bunch of low quality training to the detriment of your health and long-term fitness. And this should really give you permission to focus on having high quality training and being present in your life and attending to your overall health and well-being.
So I'm curious, you've got 6 weeks till Leadville. What are your strategies going to be over the next 6 weeks to, feel like you're going into that race, understanding of what your body can do at elevation, and are you going to consider going early?
I will consider going early. During the week, my focus is still just going to be on having high quality runs that don't distract from my life. That means most days I'll be doing 10 miles on easy trails, either running directly from my house or a 5-minute drive. I'm not trying to get up and do a 14er every other day. I'm trying to make sure that training feels good for me and I'm able to recover well, that my sessions are high quality, and I'm still doing high intensity interval workouts to work on my overall fitness, speed, and running economy, particularly because the Leadville 100 is so flat. I know that sounds crazy to say. There is a big climb in the middle of it, but it's a very flat, there's 2 climbs. It's a very flat race, and you want to have good running economy and good turnover. So that's still going to be something I focus on. And then on the weekends, I am going to get up higher and I'm going to run routes that are sort of like the dynamics of the routes are similar to Leadville, which means I want to do a big climb, run downhill hard, and then make myself have good turnover after smashing up my quads on the downhill. So I'll likely be running Aspen Mountain and then Highlands and then running back to town. So I'll get like 6K of vert and then have to finish the run with like 2 to 3 miles on the bike path. So that's kind of like a little baby simulation. I'm going to be practicing my nutrition and hydration. And then I will get out to the course. But again, the goal is not to like acclimate. The goal is to get comfortable with the course and build fun memories for myself so that when I revisit it, I can remember feeling good, feeling powerful, feeling happy on the off chance I feel differently during the race.
Nice.
I do want to do Hope Pass, partially because I just really like that run. I also think it's a good part of the course to scout before you go and run it, because it is steep, it is technical, and it's just a good thing to be familiar with, particularly the really grindy section right outside of Winfield.
That section's really hard.
It is hard, but I've done it before, and I'll do it again. And I think, again, it's not trying to be overly specific to the detriment of high-quality training.
Love it. Well, we'll check in with you next week and see how it's all going. Thanks, everybody.
Sorry, I've got the cheese burps.
Cheese burps?
Cheese burps.
All right, that's the last word. Have a good one, guys.